Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Injustice Anywhere radio program. My name is Bruce Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of Injustice Anywhere. We are an all-volunteer organization working to correct wrongful convictions. We have now developed a network of websites all working to bring more attention to wrongful convictions. You can view our main website at injustice-anywhere.org. You can also Google Injustice Anywhere, and you should see our main website right there at the top of the page. We currently have 8 featured cases. Those cases are detailed on our homepage. When visiting, you will also find Facebook and Twitter links. Please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter in order to keep up to date with current events. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Brian Peixoto case with advocate Lisa Munger. Brian Peixoto was convicted in 1996 for the murder of his girlfriend's 3-year-old son, Christopher Affonso Jr., and sentenced to life in prison in Massachusetts. Peixoto's supporters state that the child died from injuries sustained during a fall, not from child abuse, and they have 4 nationally and internationally recognized medical experts that agree with them. Tonight we will discuss the information from those new experts, which is certainly new evidence in the case. Please visit brianpeixoto.com to learn more about the case. That's BrianPeixoto.com. You can also join the discussion on our Injustice Anywhere forum at injusticeanywhereforum.com. Tonight we'll be taking calls in the final segment of the show. Please call in with any comments or questions, generally after 8:30. The number here is 347-850-1478. We also encourage our listeners to post questions on our Injustice Anywhere Facebook group page. Sarah will be there as well to participate in the discussion. Just search for Injustice Anywhere on Facebook, and you should have no problem finding our main group page there. I would now like to introduce our guest to the show. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Bruce.
Now, you've been advocating for Brian for a few years now, correct?
I have.
Are you involved with the website that I mentioned?
Yes, I was one of the creators of the website.
Okay. So it's an excellent site. I encourage all of our listeners to go there. It literally has everything you could think to ask about the case laid out very nicely on that site, so you did a great job on that.
Thank you. Brian and I actually collaborated and wrote all of those pages together. So
it's very well done. Before we get into the details of the case, could you give our listeners a brief overview of what Brian's life was at the time? He was 26 years old at the time of his arrest, correct?
Correct. So he had shared custody of his then 4-year-old daughter. He had broken up with her mother and living in an apartment in Westport. And, you know, he was in that place wondering if he was going to get back with Amber's mother and whatnot. And he was seeing a girl, and it was not terribly serious. It was about 5 or 6 months into the relationship. And he was working full-time at a concrete company, and he was working a second job as security at a nightclub to help support his family. So
life was going well. He was well employed. He had a 4-year-old daughter, and he was, at the time, separated from her mother?
Yes.
Okay. How did Brian meet Ami Sneed?
Brian was introduced to Amy actually by a Westport police officer. It was a mutual friend, and he introduced them, and I guess she started going to the club where he was security, and that was about it.
Okay. And how long had they known each other at the time of his arrest?
I would say 5 months.
Was it a relationship that anyone would consider serious, or were they just dating on and off? What was the status?
No, not serious. You know, seeing each other here and there. She was staying at his place probably a little more often than not due to she had her electricity and phone turned off throughout that time. So
okay.
Brian felt bad and gave them a place to stay every now and then.
And Brian had a house of his own?
No, he was, because he had recently moved out of the apartment he had shared with his daughter's mother, he was living in an apartment with a friend of his. So he was sharing the apartment.
Okay. Now, Amy had more than one child.
She did. She had one other at the time, a 4-year-old daughter.
Now, her stay in his home was considered to be temporary, was it not?
Oh, sure. I mean, it was not unlike any other, I suppose, couple where, you know, sometimes you stay at one's house or not, no set schedule or anything like that. But in this case, it was winter, and her electricity and phone had been turned off for lack of payment, and she was not able to stay with her mother. So she pretty much called Brian and cried, and he felt bad and obviously was not going to turn away children in need of a warm home in the winter, so he let them stay a little more often.
So he was doing what he could to help.
Yeah.
And you said he had shared custody with his daughter Amber as well?
Yes.
So she was living periodically at that same residence?
She was actually, for the most part, with Brian's mother. I'm not sure as to the specifics of the custody arrangement, but I know that Brian's mother had her for quite a long time. I think shortly after the arrest and whatnot. I don't know exactly what the custody situation was beforehand, but Amber was with Brian pretty much every weekend at least.
Okay. Now Amy had the two children, Christopher and Teresa. How old was Teresa?
4, just a year older than Christopher.
And she was home at the time?
She was the only one that was,
had his medical situation. Now, we jump to the afternoon of, it's January 22nd, 1996, when Christopher and Teresa were in the basement of the home, and he apparently had a seizure or he collapsed. Is that correct?
A seizure is what they came down the stairs to find him. And seizure was Brian's word. The little girl had come up the stairs yelling, "Bubba is throwing up." So if you can picture an apartment with the basement stairs, the kitchen was at the top of the stairs. Amy was up there smoking a cigarette. Brian was actually at the other end of the house, down the hall in the bathroom. He was just coming up, and the little girl was calling out that her brother needed help. So Brian came running down the hallway, and Amy joined him, and then they went down together. And Brian describes what they saw as the seizure. Rolling around, banging his head banging the back of his head off the floor. His eyes were rolling and convulsing.
And what did they do then? Did they call an ambulance, or did they take Christopher to the hospital on their own?
Well, first Brian scooped him up because he was throwing up, so he wanted to make sure that he cleared the vomit so he wouldn't choke. So he scooped him up. He brought him over to the sink, tried to wash the vomit out of him. He did some basic life-saving attempts, and the fire station was actually less than a mile down the road from the apartment, so he thought it would be faster to just drive right to the fire station than to wait for an ambulance. So they all packed up into the pickup truck and ran to the fire station.
And then then they took Christopher to the hospital where he was pronounced dead.
Right. Correct.
Okay. Now, the hospital staff noticed what they believed to be suspicious bruises on Christopher while he was at the ER, and they contacted police. Is that correct?
Yes, and the Department of Children and Families. It used to be the Department of Social Services.
And this led police to question Brian and Amy.
Correct.
Now, at that time, on that evening of the questioning, were their stories similar?
Their stories were actually identical. That's been Brian's one and only version, and only, unfortunately, number 1 of 8 for Amy.
So they were both upstairs. They heard the sister screaming that her brother needed help. They both ran downstairs together to find Christopher having a seizure.
Correct.
Were there any signs that Amy could have been abusing her children? Were there any marks on the other child?
Good question. We don't know much about the other child because what happened was in the emergency room, the department took custody of Teresa. They actually gave her to a family member of Amy's, and Amy never got her back from that point on. In fact, after trial, she was actually given custody to Christopher's father, who was not Teresa's biological father.
So I know the child was only 4 years old, but there was no questioning involved with Teresa to see if anybody was down in the basement with them at the time?
Well, you know what happened? When I checked the statements to see, they did interview Teresa with a social worker and the investigators from the DA's office and some state police troopers and detectives and whatnot, but it was 7 days after the death. And she had been with Amy's family that entire time. And when I read through the transcript from the state police officer that was present during the questioning of Teresa, when I looked through that statement, the things that she had said were so incredibly outrageous that both sides agreed, yeah, we can't use this. because it was obvious that she was coached. But the sad thing about that I would really like to point out was that somebody really could have done a better job looking at that, because if you read the words that she said to them, he was on the floor, he was sleeping, and he wouldn't wake up. That's what should have been followed through upon, and not some of the crazy things she was saying. That, I mean, it was never brought into evidence, so they just disregarded it completely.
So her interview with the police was disregarded. It was not used at trial.
Correct.
Okay. What about the daycare center? I read on the website that the daycare had questioned the marks on Christopher, and Amy just apparently laughed it off. What was that all about?
That's one of my bones of contention, and I'm grateful for the fact that we were just able to bring this up in our most recent filings with the First Circuit Court of Appeal. So he had only started at the daycare on Thursday of it was the week of the long weekend in January. He had started this daycare on Thursday. On that date, he was wearing overalls. He needed assistance going to the bathroom. They helped him, and that's when they saw all the marks. And this was just one of the daycare workers. So she logged the bruises as she was supposed to. She also notified her supervisor like she was supposed to. When Amy went to pick Christopher up, the supervisor questioned Amy about all the bruises because they were in places that were not what we would consider the result of normal everyday play. And Amy said, and she's quoted, "I know, he looks like an abused kid, huh?" The tragic thing about that is that they never filed a 51A. They never did any follow-up. And, if this was her first day at the daycare, so it's not like they knew her from anywhere to know
right.
that, hey, maybe he is a very, he's an accident-prone kid. But he's covered. And at trial, both the daycare worker and the program supervisor were questioned, and they both gave an accounting, and then the program director, in her direct and cross-examination, was very specific about her exchange with Amy when Amy went to pick him up. The entire exchange about all of the bruises and what Amy said. And so Amy, just being a witness at trial, was not in the courtroom when that testimony was given. And so when she testified on cross-examination, she was asked about, were you ever spoken to by the daycare workers or program director about the bruises? And she said no. And cross-examination continued, are you sure you were never asked about any bruises on him? Nope. So that's the whole situation with the daycare. But to be honest with you, I'm still shocked that there's never been any follow-up as to holding those people accountable for failing to file on the mother.
Right. Could have certainly possibly prevented what happened.
Absolutely.
As a result. Now, the same question applies to Brian. Were there any signs of abuse on Brian's daughter, Amber, or any past history of abuse at all regarding him and his daughter?
Absolutely
nothing at all. Okay.
Nope. And Brian never saw any injuries on Christopher because it was January, so he was always in long clothing, long sleeve shirts, long pants, and although there were a few different reports, ultimately Amy did say no, he never bathed or changed Christopher. So if he's never bathed or changed him, and the kid's always in long clothing, he never saw anything. Right.
Was there ever any testimony or anything suggesting that Brian and the children were alone for periods of time before the seizure occurred on that day?
I don't know what numbered version of events that would be for Amy, but her story had evolved. So until she was further and further away from Brian, or rather placing Brian alone with Christopher. So that was
just on that one day, or on previous occasions?
I don't think necessarily on previous occasions. No, because Brian.
So in other
working.
words, the bruises that were on Christopher were never explained in any way whatsoever.
No.
They just let that go. They never pursued that at all.
At trial,
Right.
It was never pursued, and I think that was sort of one of the white elephant in the room. That the prosecution wasn't going to bring it up because that doesn't help their case, and the defense didn't bring it up either.
Now, the website discusses the fact that we're going to get involved in this a little bit later in the show, but it discusses the fact that Christopher fell down a flight of stairs about 10 days before his death.
Yes.
Now, the fall certainly becomes a very important detail when the new experts review the case, but was the fall taken into consideration at all at the time of Christopher's death? Were the authorities made aware of the fact that Christopher had fallen? In other words, did investigators know that accident took place when they were investigating what they perceived as a crime?
I believe the emergency room doctor said he was aware of something, but see, what's important to note about that fall is, first of all, Amy is the one that took him. She was not actually staying at Brian's house that weekend, so Brian didn't know about that fall. Christopher was with Amy's mother the night of the fall. And it was the next night. He suffered with that fractured clavicle for at least 24 hours. Amy's mother had him and called her from wherever she was and said, I think you need to take him to the ER. So she is the one that took him. She is the one that got all of the important information that was included on the discharge summary as to what to look for. And so nobody knew about any follow-up. And as far as, I think I got off topic. I apologize. You were...
Oh, no problem. My question is, when the medical examiner did the autopsy, was the medical examiner aware that the child had fallen down a flight of stairs 10 days earlier?
Nope.
It was not part of the initial investigation?
No, it wasn't. And the prosecution did a really good job of making sure that wasn't, because that blows their whole theory that Brian had any direct involvement. If it's possibly related to an accident way back, then that blows their whole case out of the water. So they weren't going to pursue it.
Now, before Amy began changing her story multiple times, their questioning initially on the first night was the same story between Brian and Amy. So they went home, and the police were awaiting autopsy results. Now, when those results came back, they were very damning. The medical examiner concluded that Christopher died from blunt force trauma to the head that occurred at or about the time of death, meaning that the people with Christopher at the time of his death would have been responsible for that death. Right. So that puts Amy and Brian as the only two on their radar at that time.
Correct.
So they bring them both back in for questioning, and Brian's story stays exactly the same, and Amy's is the one that starts to change. What does she then tell the police?
Well, what happened was, first they had the autopsy photos. So, they put one in front of her, and then she became hysterical, and then her story would change some, because they said, it doesn't make sense. Your story doesn't make sense. Because at that point, Brian had said, listen, that's my story. I'm not going to change it, so I'll just take a lawyer. And so they knew they weren't going to get anything out of him. But see, what's important to note is that Amy had more on the table. Her own mother had actually been trying to take her children away from her for neglect. So she was already in the system. She had already been investigated. Christopher was in the emergency room. He had swallowed a safety pin while in her care, and there were a few other things. So she was already she had already been investigated by the department. So she had more to lose, and it certainly would have been an easier case to make to just go after Amy, evidence-wise. However, if we're looking at making a statement, then that's all motivation for Amy to cooperate. So that's where we got up to 8 different stories. So, I mean, she went from everywhere from, well, initially they went down together immediately. And then she was up there for 3 or 4 minutes, and then Brian was never upstairs. He had been downstairs the whole time, and then Brian went downstairs, and it was 8 minutes later. I mean, those are a few of her several versions.
Okay, but the final version she gave to police is exactly what they needed, correct? She stated that Brian was in the basement alone with the children. Right. That's it. And that's all they needed. They left her alone from that point on, and she became their witness.
Well, right. She signed. There was some paperwork. So she actually had an attorney at the time of the grand jury, and there was some sort of deal made. We have some of the paperwork. We are conveniently missing one of the 4 pages of the paperwork from the district attorney, between the district attorney and her attorney at the time.
Okay. Was this case picked up immediately by the media after his arrest?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what was the media's view on this case? What was the initial view that the public heard about Brian Peixoto?
So the story that they heard was, at one point before the children were, or before Amy and Brian were upstairs, there was an episode of Ricky Lake on, and it was about unwed mothers and unwed mothers with kids with different fathers. And so Brian made a comment to her, like, you could be on that show, and it was no doubt rude, and she got very upset, and she was going to leave and everything, and he apologized to her, and they resolved it, and like I said, she was upstairs having a cigarette and whatnot, and he was in the bathroom, but so they dubbed it the Ricky Lake murders. That was one thing. And then when they identified Brian, because, he was working security as his second job to support his child, he was the bouncer boyfriend. So it was the Ricky Lake murder and with the bouncer boyfriend.
And they went with bouncer boyfriend because he was doing security work?
Yep.
That's how they came up with that term?
Yes.
Which misrepresents the job he had, his part-time job, regardless.
Right, and we clarified that on the media fact and fiction page of the website.
What was the time frame from his arrest until the first day of trial? How long was he in jail waiting for his trial?
13 months. And
how long was the trial from start to finish?
5 days. He was in for 12 months. He had a court-appointed attorney. He called often to try to reach his attorney. He had his family call. He had absolutely zero contact with his attorney for an entire calendar year. His attorney at the time showed up on, I believe it was the Friday before the Monday trial date. And he walked in and said, "Listen, I can get you numbers." And Brian said, what are you talking about numbers? I didn't do anything. And so Brian fired him on the spot because he didn't want anybody representing him that didn't believe in his innocence. So What happened was they had to scramble and find an attorney, and that's what they did, and the judge didn't want to hold things and asked the attorney if he could be ready in 30 days. The attorney said yes, and that's what happened.
Was that another public defender?
No, his family had to hire one privately because Brian had let his attorney go.
Okay.
And his family had to go out and hire attorneys.
Once they got to trial, did he have a proper defense?
No.
Was it just an overwhelming burden with the case, with the media frenzy and the case against him, or was there incompetence by his attorney?
A little of both. Certainly a lot of the ineffective assistance of counsel, but it's very important to know that the whole Louise Woodward incident occurred 1 month before Brian's trial. It was about an hour away from where Brian's trial was being held. So although it was national news, it was huge in the Boston area. It was huge. So it was a very similar case involving the death of a child, and the public was outraged. They had to go through the entire jury pool of 70 before they could, slap together a jury for this. So it was a very difficult time here in Massachusetts for that type of case.
So the environment was certainly not a good environment to be given a fair trial at that time.
He was not going to get a fair trial on many levels, the first of which being that it involves the death of a child. But the Louise Woodward case did not help either. The
prosecution at trial, they brought in a hired gun to describe the injuries inflicted on the child. What can you tell us about Dr. Eli Neuberger?
Dr. Eli Neuberger is gun for hire by the state of Massachusetts. He has been qualified somewhere along the way based on his appearances. He does not have certification in child abuse pediatrics. He has no forensic background. And he testified at trial that he had absolutely no firsthand knowledge of the evidence in the case. He had not seen an X-ray. All he did was he was presented essentially with the autopsy reports, and that's what he went on.
Okay. But he came into the courtroom and told the jury that this child was abused, and that abuse resulted in the child's death. Correct.
He said, and to add to that, because he was known for his courtroom dramatics, he said that that the impact of the injuries was the same as if the child was dropped from a 2-story window onto concrete. So he certainly painted a visual for the jury. And just to add to that, he said the same thing verbatim at the Louise Woodward trial when he testified for the state just 1 month later.
So that was his general speech.
That was his cookie-cutter reference, yep.
Did the defense attorney for Brian cross-examine this expert? Did he adequately do anything to shut down the dramatics in the courtroom?
No, he pretty much accepted the testimony of both state experts. And what's important to note is that this attorney had actually been a prosecutor just a few years back. He came out of the prosecutor's office to go into private practice for a bit. He actually returned to the prosecutor's office at some point, and then both he and the prosecutor went on to become Superior Court judges. And they actually now sit in the same county as the judge who oversaw Brian's case.
Okay. Now, did they bring up any experts at all to provide information at the trial?
No,
nothing at all.
The only people that testified for the defense was Brian himself and the social worker that was at the hospital at the time. And the unfortunate thing about that social worker was that for one reason or another, she was not allowed to present all of the information from her notes. The most important fact from her notes being that in the waiting room, or in the family room rather, after the doctor came out to speak with them, Amy went to get Teresa, and she said, "No, I don't want you. I want Brian." And she went to Brian. She didn't even want to go with her mother. And the jury was not allowed to hear that exchange.
That was kept from trial.
Right. So that's it. That was the defense.
It's pretty easy to see how the jury convicted. They had no defense, basically, to listen to at all for Brian. They had a medical examiner that stated the child died at the time of the injury. They had a high-powered hired gun come in to tell them how brutal the child abuse was. They were really left with no choice other than to convict.
Well,
unfortunately,
you know what,
they didn't hear the fact of the case. They heard a presentation put on by the prosecution that was not the truth. And
that's correct. And you wouldn't think, though, necessarily that it was a slam dunk, and here's why. Because everybody heard, although Amy had only given her testimony, she was not in the courtroom when the other people presented their testimony, but you could hear, it was obvious that there were several different versions that she was putting out there. She had contradictions with everybody. The state trooper testified that she told him in her initial police interview that they went down together immediately. So he testified to that. So already the jury hears what she told him initially and then what she told at trial. Also, the emergency room doctor, when he interviewed Amy after the death and said what happened, when he provided his testimony, he said, I spoke to Amy and she said, quote, and he used the word quote to describe, again, her initial version of events. So the jury did hear several versions of events from her, so they should have, common sense says at least there's reasonable doubt because there are clearly several different versions from this.
Right.
Man.
But the most damning evidence to me was the medical examiner claiming that the accident happened at the time. It was only Brian and Amy at the house at the time. So the jury really only would be able to decide in their minds, was it Amy or Brian? That would be the only reasonable doubt because they were given what they felt was expert evidence. But we would, many years later would go by before we would find out that that medical examiner was just wrong. Now, the break didn't come until 2011 when an episode of Frontline appeared on PBS. Can you explain how that show broke this case open again?
I will. And you know what? Can I just backtrack for a quick second? I just want to say, so when you asked about the defense in terms of questioning the state's medical experts, and I tell you, for lack of a better term, he accepted what they had to offer. Well, he actually accepted that in his opening statement because in his opening statement, Brian's attorney said this child was killed. So he already took the idea that it could be anything accidental off the table. So he already conceded that the child was killed.
Okay, which is just not the proper defense for his client.
Right. And it's certainly ineffective assistance of counsel because if you're going to make a statement if you're going to put something out there in your opening statement, then you need to set out to prove that. It's
another factor too that shows how this trial went horribly wrong because the evidence that was presented at trial was incorrect. This is one of those cases I have a hard time pinning on the jury in any way because it was just so poorly represented, compared to what actually took place. I'd like to spend the second half of the show discussing what actually took place, how this child died, and what really happened. Because when you look at the new experts that have come forward, they completely demolished what that medical examiner said. But those experts didn't come forward until this Frontline episode appeared on PBS. That really opened the door for new people to come forward to look at the case. What did that TV show, what did that special have to say?
So that show aired in June of 2011 and featured a medical examiner, and it featured a few other specialists and an attorney involved in a case down there. And we had actually written to, Brian wrote to the 3 doctors and the attorney featured on that show, and we actually got a reply from Dr. Michael Laposada, who was actually originally from Boston. He was at Mass General Hospital, and he was working at Vanderbilt University Medical Center at the time, and he offered to review the documentation. So we sent him all of the autopsy reports to review. Dr. Laposada said a lot, but what is absolutely most important was that he said that the injuries were survivable and treatable. And as we know, although we haven't gotten into it much yet, he lived with those injuries for 10 days before he died. He exhibited what Dr. Laposada says are neurological symptoms for days. These are the exact symptoms that Amy was instructed to watch out for. Bring him back immediately if you see him acting wobbly, acting lethargic, just not being himself. And she ignored her for 10 days, and almost everybody that testified said that he had one symptom or another of that. Every single person, the daycare workers, the roommates, everybody. He was falling up and downstairs. In fact, he didn't go to daycare that day because he couldn't even stand up. He couldn't.
So this information was presented at trial?
That he was stumbling. Yes.
That was presented by the defense?
Well, no. Technically, it was presented by various witnesses. Said things like, "Oh yeah, we saw him. He was falling a lot and whatnot," but it wasn't explored by the defense. It wasn't effectively challenged by the defense. It was there.
So the defense simply did not capitalize on the fact that this child had fallen down the stairs 10 days prior, and all these symptoms leading up to his death were completely ignored by the defense attorney because he just went and believed what the medical examiner had said.
Correct.
Even though bits and pieces of this still came up throughout trial.
Correct. It was all there. It just had to be pulled together. And unfortunately, that didn't happen.
So according to the expert that came forward after the PBS show, the medical examiner that did the autopsy was completely wrong with his diagnosis.
Absolutely. Yep.
And since that time, multiple other experts have come forward to say the same thing.
Correct. So just to add to Dr. LaPosada, the next expert we got was Dr. Lainey Squire, and she analyzed the autopsy procedures, and she pointed out in her report and in her affidavit that there were certain diagnostic tests that absolutely should have been done that were not done, Dura samples and a few other things that weren't done. So that was her perspective, because there were things that could have been done that absolutely would have dated the injury. For example, one thing that came out of her report and affidavit was that he had the equivalency, that little boy, that little 3-year-old's head had the equivalency of a quarter cup of blood pooled in the back of his head. That's what he had there for 10 days. That was evident
to these new experts that took a look at the case long after the trial. This is in 2011.
Right. It was right in the autopsy reports, because that's what we sent them to look at.
So the evidence was there for all to see, but the medical examiner's conclusion was just taken as gospel, and that was that.
Correct. And at the autopsy, and this was one of the concerns that Dr. LaPosada had, as far as the objectivity of the medical examiner, there were a total of 7 police officers and 1 investigator from the DA's office present at the autopsy. So unfortunately what happens there is, there's this pressure, and then the mindset of the medical examiner becomes prosecutorial. And that's what drove the investigation and ultimately the trial. And it was, guilty until proven innocent, unfortunately.
It certainly sounds that way. It sounds like his defense could have been much more effective also, but did his family have the means to hire an expert, or was money a factor when it came to his defense?
Money was certainly a factor, and back then, 20 years ago, I'm going to guess it was upwards of $25,000. I know his mother had to take out a second mortgage on the house. I'm not sure how else they pulled it all together, but absolutely.
That was just for his attorney.
Yes.
So that left nothing for them to pursue an expert on their own.
Right. Well, they didn't know things at the time. That's, you don't know what you don't know.
Of course not. You're put into a situation that's unknown to you. You're looking to your attorney for guidance in those matters. It would have been up to the attorney to suggest, hey, we need an expert to counter what the medical examiner has stated.
Correct.
Now, I don't know if we'll get calls today, because I can tell people on Facebook are listening intently. This is a brand new case for our listeners. But if anybody does have a question or a comment on the case, the number here is 347-850-1478. So you can call in with any questions or comments on the case. That's 347-850-1478. We did have one question on Facebook. I think we've hit on it pretty well, but it's still one of those things that's sticking out in my mind too, is why wasn't the fall highlighted at trial by the defense? But I think we've gone over that a couple times now. The defense attorney basically believed what the medical examiner had said. Is that not what his position was?
Right. He said in his opening statement that the child was killed. So if the child was killed, that has nothing to do with an accidental fall 10 days earlier.
So he didn't feel that the fall had anything to do with the case, which is just a blatant error on the defense attorney's part, because his job is to find his client not guilty at trial. So I would think he would research every avenue, which it looks like simply did not happen.
Correct. And just if we're going down that road, as to not only him not properly defending Brian, but his position was that, and he told Brian's family that I'm not going to attack a grieving mother. So she's on the stand and she's crying. He's bringing her a glass of water. I mean, there was no, he had an obligation to defend his client, and if he's going to make a statement that the child was killed, and the only 2 adults in the home are Brian and the boy's mother, and it's not going to be your client, then you really need to make an effective argument as to why it could be his mother. or at least more of an effective argument as to why it's not Brian.
Right. He placed that information in the jury's minds right from the get-go. Now, Brian has a new legal team now, correct?
Yes, he does.
And with all this new information, I believe there's 4 new experts that have provided affidavits for this case. What is the current status? Are his attorneys planning to file a petition? Has the petition been filed? Where does that stand right now?
So we just filed recently, just a few weeks ago, a petition for successive habeas corpus. And the reason that it's successive is because the appeals process details Brian's appeals process over the last few years, or actually going back from shortly after trial. But it highlights Brian had problems not only at trial, but his appellate attorney had lied about filing paperwork on time. And so what happened was the whole AEDPA came into effect, and Brian was time barred from filing his appeal. His attorney at the time, his appellate attorney, had lied and said that he filed something in time when in fact he hadn't. And so that was considered a first appeal. So Brian, years later, filed on his own. And he was not able to be successful because of the time bar issue. And so with the McQuiggan decision in May of 2013, that came out and said actual innocence, if proved, can overcome any procedural hurdle, most specifically the time bar issue. And so that opened the door. And that's why we're going in for the request for successive habeas corpus petition for actual innocence. So we've got to get through a gatekeeper, if you will. We've got to request permission, basically, in order to file for actual innocence. And we've got to get over some procedural hurdles. Right,
and hopefully these new experts that have come forward will certainly help Brian get over those hurdles. But it's very difficult to prove incompetence of a defense attorney, and so the time bar thing is one of those things that drives me insane when I hear, because an administrative mistake can cause a person to spend the rest of their life in prison. So for me, that's one of the things that it's another show. It's a whole different discussion.
Yeah,
but that's something in the system that really needs to be corrected, because it's very difficult for somebody like Brian to go back and say, hey, my attorney was incompetent. Nobody wants to hear that. They just want to say, well, you're barred by time. You didn't file.
Right. Especially not when your attorney goes on to become a judge. So.
And this all happened between the time of his arrest, all of his appeals up through 2011 that were unsuccessful. That was during that time frame. Did he keep that same attorney throughout, or did he have, how many different sets of attorneys did he have?
So he had a trial attorney, and then he had an appeals attorney in 1999. That's when he was, let's see, that was denied in 2000. And then in 2000, later in 2000 rather, Brian's family met with another attorney, and that's the attorney that lied about when he filed, and that's when Brian became time barred.
Okay. And that led up to the 2011 Frontline episode that brought the new experts forward.
Right. That with the second appellate attorney, that went on for about 2 to 3 years, closer to 4 maybe, and then just after that in 2005 is when Brian filed his pro se petition, and then that was decided less than a year later in 2006, and then he was essentially going to give up until 2011, until that show.
Okay. We do have a few calls holding, so I'd like to go to those calls. We have a 508 area code. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have a comment. I am actually Brian's mother. And,
welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. And I just want to thank you that you have presented this opportunity to have a forum to be able to speak about these things that we have felt for so long we had no voice. As I was listening and marking down some of the things that were popping out to me, the last thing I wanted to do was to give an excuse to an attorney for not doing his job well. However, the fact that this medical this medical information was never pursued. I really believe that they had no course to actually look deeper into what those injuries were all about. I can remember at one time saying to the attorney, something was wrong with that child. They said that he was stumbling around like a little drunk boy. Something was wrong with him. Now, he did not take those comments to push to a point where perhaps he would have looked more seriously into medical information. But had he done so at that time, he may not have found what we have now, because these things are considered, maybe the term is not newly discovered, but they're scientifically being proven that earlier fall injuries can become a death sentence to a small child, that these slow brain bleeds can become symptomatic, and you can see some of the things that happen because of the blood accumulating in the brain. So not to give an excuse for a poor counsel, what would they have come up to had they gone in that direction? They didn't have all this information then. We have it
right
now.
Things have come forward, and many advances in science and medicine have come forward since that time.
Exactly. And even though we did have a feeling that there was something wrong with the child prior, because we know Brian, he was a big teddy bear. He may have had a label bouncer on him, but everybody knows that a bouncer diffuses situations. He doesn't physically remove people unless they're really worthy of something like that, but their job is to diffuse. And that's who Brian was. He was always the big teddy bear, loved the kids. The fact that this medical information is now available to us, it just means so much. And for us to have that open door into the court system again, to be able to explore this, to come to the truth, I'm so grateful. And again, I'm so grateful for your program. I thank you so much. And our dear,
thank you. It's a great point to make, because it highlights the fact that this is brand new evidence. This is evidence that was not available during his trial. So it should definitely open the door for at least a hearing on this case. It's not something that was even possible to discover at the time, because it was unknown.
Right. And that's why the legal system, they must please take time to hear this again. My son is not guilty of anything.
I want to thank you again for the call. This case has been very compelling to me. It's a new case that we just started looking at, and to me, it's a ridiculous case. It's hard to imagine that he spent this much time in prison up to this date for this. He had clearly nothing to do with the death of this child. So we'll continue trying to shine the spotlight on your son's case.
Wonderful. I thank you so very much, and I thank Lisa so very much.
I'd like to go to the next call. It's a 920 area code. Do you have a question or a comment?
Hi, Bruce. It's Lori.
Hello, Lori.
Hi. I just wanted to give Lisa some encouragement. I advocate for a man who is on death row in Mississippi for he dropped a baby, taking her out of the bathtub, and she died quite soon after that. He's been on death row for 12 years, and we recently got new evidence by expert opinions, not La Posada, who is awesome, I know, but some really, really good opinions, all in Jeff's favor. And the case has been reopened, and so you just have to keep on pushing. I'm lucky because I've got Bruce and I've got Jen and I've got other people that are behind me, but I'm his advocate too, and I know exactly what you go through, and it's maddening. It's the same thing with Jeff's case. The medical examiner testified that it was the force of a 2-story drop.
Right.
That's just that was what they believed at the time, but we know now that's not true. So I'm just appalled that both parents were home and somehow Brian is the one. Well, okay, yeah, the mother and Brian were home, and somehow he's the one in prison for this. It's appalling to me. But I just wanted to offer you some encouragement because we went so long with no hope, and in the last year, it's just everything's changed, and now he's before the court again, and we have a lot of hope.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I did hear the last radio show, actually, with you and Jen Fitzgerald. So I did hear the new evidence. So we're praying for you as well.
Yeah, well, that's mutual. Okay. Thanks for taking my call.
Thank you, Lori. Thanks for the call.
Okay, bye, Bruce.
We have one more call holding here. It's an 814 area code. You're on the air. Do you have a question or comment?
Hi, Bruce. My name's Vicki, and I'm actually calling some of my questions. I actually had 4 questions. Some of them have been touched on. But
okay.
I'm kind of maybe asking, presenting this to Lisa. On what did the jury convict Brian? I'm trying to understand why Brian. What did they? What was he convicted on?
That's a great question because to boil this all down, Brian was convicted on the medical examiner's testimony that said that essentially the last person with Christopher had to have caused his fatal injuries, and that was supported by Amy's testimony, which placed Brian alone with him. That is in a nutshell.
That's where I wanted to go with that. So I caught earlier you said that Amy, I think you said that you have record that she changed her story up to 8 times.
Yes.
And then I heard you all touch on the program that the jury did hear a couple conflicting statements. Did they ever actually hear, was it ever specifically said to them, this mom has told this many accounts, can we believe her now when she says that Brian was alone? I'm just wondering where the defense attorney went with that.
He did touch upon that, I suppose, but obviously nothing effective. But you have to remember at the time the Louise Woodward incident was so huge. It was still on the daily news here up in Boston, and it sort of overshadowed everything. And I mean, Brian, he was just not going to get a fair trial. The public was already outraged.
This from what I'm reading, and I'm thinking, and I know there are more, but there are 3 names that come to my mind, and 3 cases that have some similarities. Brian, who you advocate for, Jeffrey Harvard, who I believe Lori just spoke to, Clayton Labrota, who is my son. There's so many similarities in their stories. In each one of those stories, and I'm not trying to say anything I shouldn't, but in each one of those stories, there's a mom that seemingly wasn't providing good child care, and somehow these men get convicted by the jury. Do you think the media plays a part in that with the stories and the labels and so on? Is it easier for a jury to convict a man?
Of course. Well, the prosecution, the prosecution starts the wheels in motion. She feeds a few pieces of information or made up information rather to the media, and she's the one that leaks this stuff and lets them run with it. So and obviously she's not working to put the mother in prison. So she's putting the ball in play.
Okay, and this is my final question, and I may have missed this, but I know that on Brian's website, and I think that you all touched on it tonight, the daycare worker, and I believe you said at the hospital also that the little boy had bruises that were not visible, and unless he was undressed.
Correct.
Was the jury ever made aware that he had older bruises?
Yes.
Oh, they were. Okay.
Yes. So the daycare worker and the daycare supervisor both gave essentially the listing of the bruises all over Christopher. They both provided those, and the daycare supervisor said on both direct and cross-examination, she relayed the communication she had with Amy about that, the specific conversation. And then Amy got up and said no conversation ever took place. So they have that information.
And I have trouble in my mind trying to, I guess I can't get in the juror's mind when I hear that to think, okay, well, I wish you well, and it sounds like things are on the right track, and I thank you all for taking my call.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you. You mentioned your son's name. Is he still convicted?
Yes.
What was his name?
His name is Clayton Mabroda, Mibroda. He actually was convicted of killing his daughter, my granddaughter, who was 20 days old.
Okay, and you've said there's a website for him as well?
Yes, we just completed it. It's www.a-wounded-heart.com.
Okay, we'll take a look at that. Thank you for the call.
Thank you. Good luck to you, Lisa. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Vicki.
I'm going to try to go to this call again. It looks like we had it on earlier. The prefix on the number is 294.
Hi, I'm Amber. I'm actually Brian's daughter.
Oh, hi. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. So I just want to say hi, Lisa. Thank you very much for everything that's been going on. We appreciate it. I just want to touch on something that I don't think anybody really realizes, is that my dad is an amazing person. The struggle it has been for all of our family to go through is crazy. And to finally have hope that there's something that can be done is amazing. And it's because of shows like this and publicity and people that are showing their support for our family. It's uncontrollable. It's so outstanding. And I just want to thank all of you for helping us.
Well, it's heartening to hear you speak about your father, and it's cases like this that we try to bring more attention to as our group, but it's people like Lisa that take on these cases. It's individuals that come forward long before anybody else and refuse to be quiet about it and just keep shouting and shouting and shouting, wondering if anybody's listening.
But before Lisa came around, I think my family kind of lost hope. There was nobody else that knew what the next step would be. We had kind of had all the doors shut in our faces and said, you know what, this is something we're going to have to deal with. And I think now with everything, all the new evidence and all of these supporters and everybody who's just come forward, it's like a dream come true. And it's unreal. It's unreal to go 19 years without your father and one day waking up and thinking, hey, there's a chance that he can come out. And my dad still has so much life. He has so much to still accomplish. He's still so young, and he's such a great person, and he is the last person on earth that deserves to be treated this way and to be talked about this way and to have this terrible thing be brought into his life like this. It's crazy, and it's unreal.
Well, I'm very hopeful this new expert evidence that's come forward will finally open that door. Now, stay strong, never give up.
You're right, one day closer.
Amber, one day closer, honey, one day closer.
I know.
Thank you so much for the call.
Thank you.
Now, as we wrap up the show here, Lisa, is there anything that you'd like to conclude with?
Just that Christopher was not, sadly, he was not the only victim as a result of that nightmare 19 years ago. And that's obvious, if nothing else, that by Amber. I mean, this was a girl who lost her father at the age of 4 years old. He wasn't there. He wasn't there when she rode her first bike. He wasn't there for her high school graduation. And he prays one day to be there to walk her down the aisle. He has a mother and a father and a sister and an extended family. There were lots of victims that night as a result that accident.
That's absolutely true. One thing that Injustice Anywhere often touches on is that wrongful convictions definitely do create additional victims, and so many people are affected when this happens. So it's an excellent point to make. We will be adding this case to our endorsed cases list on our website, injustice-anywhere.org. We believe this is a clear case of wrongful conviction. Please visit brianpeixoto.com. That's BrianPeixoto.com to learn more about this case. And please join the discussion on our Injustice Anywhere forum. That's at injusticeanywhereforum.com. We need people to stand up and talk about these cases because that's the only way the public is going to hear about them is by word of mouth. There's only so much that can be done by one person. We need other people to stand up and talk about these cases. So please join in on the discussion. I want to thank you again, Lisa, for being here tonight. Thank you for all the information on the case.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Next week, we'll be discussing the Cameron Todd Willingham case. It's a death penalty case in Texas. We believe that it's now very clear that Texas has put an innocent man to death. This is a case that really highlights the flaws of the death penalty in this country. So please tune in next week at 8 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And please check our main website, injustice-anywhere.org, for information on all of our radio shows. You can listen to all the past shows right there on the website in the radio archive at any time. The link for that archive is right on the home page. Thank you for tuning in.